a core learning from the work that I've done in practice is that conflict is good when it's well handled.
Mm.
Conflict actually provides opportunities for innovation, for creativity.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Strategy in Leadership Podcast. One of the things as a professional meeting facilitator, I have to work with groups that sometimes don't always align. They don't always see the same thing. Sometimes they might say the same thing, but can't hear each other. And at the heart of it is conflict. But how do you work through conflict? How are you resilient through conflict? Well, my guest today, Bob Bordone, who is a USA Today bestselling author, senior fellow at Harvard Law School, is here to talk to us about conflict resilience. I'm really excited for it because it's something that as organizations go through a lot of change, as you have to have important conversations with a lot on the line, the ability to talk through and work through conflict is critical, especially if you have different backgrounds, different experiences, different views of what's correct in the world. So, Bob, thanks for joining us today on the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. Happy to have you here.
Anthony, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So why don't you tell our listeners, I did a little bit about your bio. You've been in the field for almost 30 years. Tell us about your life, tell us about your work, tell us about your book, and we'll get into some questions.
Yeah, sure. So I've spent pretty much my whole professional career focused on things related to conflict and negotiation and difficult conversations. Much of that was in the academic realm. I led the negotiation workshop at Harvard Law School for more than 20 years. But one of the things I really did about halfway through that period was start the school's negotiation and mediation clinic. And maybe for those in medicine, the clinic makes a lot of sense. That means you're treating patients. Sometimes people ask, what does that mean in law school? And it means the same thing. We're actually working in the real world with clients, both who are struggling with individual conflicts, but over time, really looking at groups. Actually, a lot of the work you do, Anthony, right? Facilitating differences and challenges either on teams or between teams and groups. I left that full time job in 2019 with an interest on doing more on political polarization and differences across or disputes across lines of difference. And among the other things I did was write this book with a brain scientist, which was a really fun collaboration. And the book came out in March. So as we said before we got on this podcast, I've been doing a lot of podcasts and just going around talking a lot about the book and its applicability across kind of industries and contexts.
I love that. I mean, in 2025, we're not going to get into it too much, but let's call it political polarization can cause cascading conflicts amongst groups. And in corporate America, corporate Canada, corporate the world, you can't expect everybody on your team to have the same political beliefs or global backgrounds. And so those are the things that probably don't show up as explicitly, but subvertively can disrupt teams. One of the other things that, like, you opened up a clinic, well, it's a consulting or medical practice because there's no such thing as getting it right. There is always working on it. You're always practicing. And so as our leaders who are leading teams, driving forward, doing their best in a tough, economic climate, political climate, what are some things that they can do to improve their ability to work through conflict, either practically or neurologically?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. So I think the first thing they can do, which may seem simple, but I actually think is not so simple, is to really reframe what they think of when they think of conflict. Because part of the motivation for me around this book, in my work, we often talk about conflict prevention or conflict resolution or avoiding conflict. And I think all of those, I'm not opposed to conflict resolution, but the idea of prevention or avoiding actually is a bit troubling to me because I think a core learning from the work that I've done in practice is that conflict is good when it's well handled.
Mm.
Conflict actually provides opportunities for innovation, for creativity. And if you're a leader who's spending a lot of time trying to create some kind of diverse environment with the broadest notion of what diversity means, that is of little good if once you have all the people in the organization, all you do is set up employee resource groups and you never get the benefit of their different thinking. So I guess first thing I would say, right, is reframe conflict as opportunity, conflict as opportunity for connection, conflict as opportunity for innovation. And I think that is a big change and reframe. And I could say lots of the reasons why, more why I think that's important, but it's from a neurological perspective, that actually takes some work because kind of our brains are so kind of not updated, meaning that they're really designed to protect us, but in some ways from threats that existed day to day, maybe thousands of years ago. So we experience conflict sometimes as an existential threat. And the brain immediately then tries to move us to a place of more comfort. And so in our book, we talk about these five F's. The ones, two of them, I think most of us probably are familiar with, right? We either fight or we flee. But there's some others that often come up. One is that some of us freeze, right? We just don't know what to say.
Hmm.
Um, Others of us fawn, meaning we like start to say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that. Please forgive me." And then the last is kind of fester, where we're kind of avoidant, but it's like boiling over, and that's like the passive aggressive behavior we see. Those immediate kind of brain responses, which might have made sense in a world where our very existence was at stake, is actually less helpful when we're working on a team. It's less helpful when we're working with an organization. It's less helpful if we're in like a civic organization, we have to work through this problem together. So the first thing we really need to do is actually retrain our brains. And this is what was so, for me, interesting working with a neurologist.
Can I
Because if you
can
would
I
have asked me,
interrupt before
yeah,
just before we get into
interrupt me.
the no
Yeah,
no
go.
it's great because
Yeah.
I think what I find is helpful for any type of reframing is to be able to name it. So already having the tool to recognize, oh, if somebody's backpedaling from something or they're being passive aggressive because the thing is bubbling over, then you can say, huh, maybe that's my clue to recognize that. One of the questions I wanted to ask before the reframing is, as you work with different groups, those not just, homogeneous groups, but diverse, how does the cultural acceptance of conflict play into this in addition to those five styles? For example, if you are from the East Coast of the US versus the West Coast of the US, culturally, there's different types of conflict that culturally it's okay. If you're in a Korean context or a Middle Eastern context, there's way different. So how does that intersection, in addition to the wiring, play into how teams work together?
Yeah, in huge ways, right? When I think about culture, I think about a number of different things, right? One is a geographic kind of culture, or maybe a national culture, like you brought up, Anthony. Another is what I might call professional cultures. So, for example, my kind of academic and professional training is in law. My co-authors was as a neurologist,
Hmm.
so it's in medicine, and there are radically different ways in which people experience or think of raising of conflict in the medical community versus the law community. Another, though, I would say is around family of origin. So some people grow up in families where I kind of grew up in a family where we were always kind of having differences, and it didn't feel like it was a fight. For others, they grow up in families where um, bringing up conflict is like a lack of decorum. And then there's a personality level to it. So that is to say that this is all very much in play. That is, in some respect, reinforcing the way our brain, which of those five F's we might run to, right? Um, we talk about with my co-author this experience of working on this book, and he was remote. He was in New York. I'm in Cambridge, Mass. He's at NYU, and so we do most of our collaboration on Zoom. And there'd be times where we'd go back and forth about something, and I thought it was a really fun conversation where we were really hashing things out. And my meeting would end, and I just gone the rest of my day. And 4 days later, I would learn that he had had these sleepless nights. It was like, does Bob hate me? And I think part of that was really just, a cultural difference. And I grew up more in a legal culture where people kind of fight more and it's not personal. There's a different kind of professional decorum where he was. And then there were personality differences about that. So big, big role.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think what it does, it helps our listeners think about, all of the different ways. So you were about to explain, how to work through these, how to maybe practice, dare I say, get being comfortable with that type of conflict so you don't maybe default to your behavior or you become either slightly more comfortable with any type of conflict or work through it as a group. So what are your piece of advice for leaders that want to improve conflict resilience in their teams?
Yeah, yeah, no, thanks for this. So this idea, right, that our neural pathways are pretty worn and comfortable with these automatic responses. But the amazing thing about our brains is that they are retrainable. They are like any other kind of muscle that we have. So that which means is that if we do something different, even if it's uncomfortable, and then we kind of succeed, or at least don't have the terrible outcome we thought we were going to get, the next time it's time to do that thing, it's a little bit easier, right? It's kind of like if you are training to get healthier, the first time you do an exercise regime, you're pretty darn sore. But if you do it again, it's a little easier, do it again, a little easier. And a few weeks later, you're not feeling that soreness. So I think the starting point, because so many people come to me and probably to you in your work, Anthony, and they say, I'm terrible at conflict, or I just don't do conflict, or I can't do this. And that assumption is just actually not true. We all have different capacities, but it's like somebody saying, I have no capacity to improve my physical fitness.
Hmm.
Now, is somebody who hasn't exercised in 30 years likely going to run a marathon in Boston in April? Probably not, although possible. But could that person improve from where they are? Absolutely. And where do you start? Wherever you are, where do you start? Just finding one domain to stretch yourself. So, for example, for people who are, if you're a leader who's kind of avoidant, right? Like conflict comes up and you pass it down to somebody else or pretend it's not there or pray it'll go away. Maybe find something really simple, like even outside of your professional life. So just to kind of give kind of a fun example, I have a friend who's quite conflict averse. When our book came out, I was quite interested to see like our bookstores carrying it. We were taking a walk together. We go past the bookstore, and I said to her, "Hey, Allie, why don't you go in there and ask them if my book is there, and if not, if they'd be willing to order it?" And she looked at me with this dread. For me, is like what that's like not much, but for her, that kind of felt like a stretch. But it was a stretch where the worst possible consequence is, yeah, I mean, the worst possible consequence is the bookseller is mean and tells her to get out, which is highly unlikely. So wherever you are in your kind of feeling on this, finding somewhere to stretch. Probably most of the leaders that you're working with who are listening would not find what I just said to be so harrowing, but they may find, well, who knows, right? Who knows, Anthony? Right, but they may find like there's a direct report or a vice president who works with them who just kind of gets their goat and is pretty insistent, and they've been just avoiding a conversation.
Yeah.
You know what? Just try that conversation. On the other side, right, for folks who maybe their tendency is to bulldoze through conflict, find some context. And again, could be relatively lower stakes where you say, I'm just going to take the role of listener, just going to ask some questions. I'm just going to build some empathy skills. Those kinds of, I think, micro steps will build over time. Um, but I think the first piece in this is appreciating you have capacity to get better wherever you are at on this. And is it going to happen in a day? No. Will there be some discomfort? Yes. But is it worth it? Yes, because I think this is the last piece I'll say for now, until you ask me, Anthony, about brain science, is that part of the reason why we often don't do this work is because our brains, in that moment when we are under threat or uncomfortable, don't immediately see what in the literature, this guy, Judd Brewer at Stanford, has coined the bigger, better offer, or the BBO.
Hmm.
So, to use that exercise regime example, in February at 5 a.m., when my alarm goes off and it's cold in Boston or cold in Vancouver, if I know I'm going to run a marathon in April, even though everyone says it's going to be really uncomfortable to run right now, I can see that bigger, better offer. I get out of the bed, I do it. A lot of times in our most harrowing conflicts, we don't see that. We don't see what the BBO is. And so I think the other piece is really trying to identify and find that BBO, which could be an agreement, but it might not be an agreement. It might be a better relationship. It might be just a kind of expansive perspective that helps you see something in a different light. It might simply be something like the other person just appreciates the effort. But finding that BBO is going to help our brains go through that period of discomfort and retraining.
What I think is interesting, so absolutely like evolutionary science, your brain elasticity, keeping you safe, not looking stupid, the baby steps on both sides, whether that's, practice discomfort by saying, no, I don't want a bite of your sandwich. Thank you. Or not bulldozing and listening. I think the caution potentially is going too far because when we see in meetings, you have somebody who would normally dominate. They're not saying anything. They're trying to put it into the other people's hands. And everybody is then those conflict avoided people. It's like, what is that person doing? And this person's like, what is that person doing? So doing it nicely. I also think one of the things that gets in the way of conflict is real fear. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
a CEO that will punish you if you disagree, and that happens a lot. And so there is not that like the idea of like the psychological safety. The psychological safety is low. Therefore, there is no conflict resilience. Therefore, you are missing the upside, the BBO of working better as a team because the output is just this person's going to fire me, demote me, yell at me, make me look stupid, whatever. And so, that's just toxic organization and nobody wants that. But presumably, there is a world where people are growth oriented, see a future for themselves, recognize the benefit of this, and that likely the best outcome doesn't live in the extremes. Like the BATNA is everybody loses. And in this case, hopefully everybody wins in this. So, two things and then we'll wrap up. Thoughts on what I just shared? And is there a question that you would have really loved for me to ask and I didn't get to it? The thing that you nerd
Uh-huh.
out on the most. But cover my BATNA first and then we'll do the next one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this point that you're making, right, which is a really big one, which as we talk about this in chapter 9, right, which we talk about, you mentioned psychological safety, right? And Amy Edmondson's work is hugely valuable in this. And we talk about how do you build a conflict resilient greenhouse. And like it's interesting for me if I think about my own like professional trajectory as somebody who kind of started teaching conflict handling skills and negotiation skills and then maybe 7 or 8 years into that, kind came to the point where I was like, okay, the skills are really important, but if you're trying to do them in an organization where you're punished, where there isn't kind of a set of systems or processes for handling conflict well, the skills are only going to take you so far. And so I started to do work around what's called dispute systems design, right? How do you design uh, systems within organizations for the effective handling of conflict. And then, kind of where I am now, started to realize like, okay, people could have skills, you might have good systems, but if people aren't willing to sit with the discomfort of the disagreement, right, that's what we call the resilient piece. It doesn't matter if they know what to say on an exam. So we kind of need all of these things optimally. One of the things that we try to address a bit, what I would call yeah buts in this is, okay, that's good advice for a leader. Build a conflict resilient greenhouse. What do I do if I don't have such a wonderful leader? And there's some limits to what you can do there. On the other hand, there are examples of lateral leadership where you can set some example and you can change some culture. But you're always doing that, I think, with some BATNA in mind, right? And really kind of assessing the culture, the organizational climate is really important.
Mm.
Uh, Gosh, what is the question that that I would want you
Or
um,
what is the
to,
thing that you just love talking about that you don't get to talk enough about? And it doesn't necessarily need to be about the book. It could be within your like 30 years of experience of something that you're like, oh, I wish more people talked about this thing that people do by a default, or why are people passive aggressive, or something like that. Something that you just love. The
Yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I love this. I love this. I mean, I have a curious way of trying to get a lot of the things that do matter to me out here. But let me maybe say this one piece, which is not actually primarily what this book ended up being about, but was what the kind of very seed of the idea when I first started to actually write a book proposal, which was very much a response to uh, increasing polarization, clearly in the United States, but also in the world. And and this thing that I saw happening, which is that in service of relationships, in service of wanting to stay connected with my sister, my father, my brother, the people who work around me, I don't bring up the hard topic
Mm.
because if I bring up the hard topic, I think I'm going to ruin the relationship. And I'm very, very sympathetic to that. But I think the thing that I would want people to focus on is that continuing to do that year after year after year ends up being the slow kill on the relationship.
Yeah.
Meaning that if all we ever talk about is how great the apple pie is, at some point, sitting around the holiday table is kind of dull and boring and almost alienating. And then it's 7 o'clock and we're like, we just have to go home and feed Rover goodbye. And then a few years later, we're like, actually, Jeannie has a soccer game, so we're not coming. And so this is not a plea to say at the Christmas table, talk about the hardest issue in your life, but it is to say if it's a relationship you care about, whether it is at work, with a boss, with a colleague, with a direct report, or in your family or with your friends, finding some time and place to talk about something that is keeping you up or that is a strain is a potential service to that relationship if you care about it. That's like something that I feel like I really want to communicate kind of in this moment, both from a leadership perspective, but just from a human relational perspective.
No, I love that. It's, said another way, don't be cheap with people. Because if you're cheap, like
Amen.
it's an investment into the relationship. And although it's uncomfortable, what is that? I can't remember what the acronym is. What is that better outcome? If you have a richer relationship, do you want a crappy, easy one or a rich, sometimes hard one? Uh, listeners, I'm not encouraging you dial up your parents and start laying your childhood trauma into them, but maybe you could start somewhere. Bob,
Yeah.
thank you for being here today. Where can folks pick up the book? Where can they connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
Yeah, Anthony, thanks for having me. And yes, you could get the book on Amazon online, or you can go to my website, bobbordone.com, or the book's website, which is conflictresiliencebook.com, conflictresiliencebook.com.
Excellent. Bob, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you today.
Thanks for having me, Anthony.
Folks, my guest today, Bob Bordone. Check out his book, Conflict Resilience. I think whether it's in the personal context, the work context, recognizing that there is something out there from conflict. Do you need to go to the nth degree? Do you need to blow up on people? No. Can you work on it as a skill? Yes. Can you say, no, thank you, I don't want pickles here, versus just getting the pickles and throwing them away? There's something in it for you, some version of empowerment, some version of opportunity, some hopefully version of better performance, so long as you have the right environment to do it. If you don't have the right environment to do it, then question, hey, maybe there's some small step that we can take towards moving it. You could send them this episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast, or encourage them to read the book as a group to say, hey, how can we build a more resilient organization? As you have more and more important and expensive conversations, those disagreements get harder and harder to do. So disagree now while the cost is low. Folks, thanks for watching today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. Thank you to my guest, Bob Bordone. My name is Anthony Taylor. It's a pleasure being with you every week. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, do all the things. Tell your friends, tell your family, and your next Christmas dinner. I'll see you soon. Until next time.